Syracuse football picks up a verbal commitment from four-star wide receiver Amare Gough, and the Orange are set to have their best recruiting class in the Fran Brown era.
You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and thank you for making us your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day, and of course, we are always free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And on today's show, later on, we'll talk about what Syracuse basketball could do with the ACC, making it so it's only 18 conference games rather than 20. So 2 more non-conference games for Syracuse basketball next season. We'll also talk about Syracuse football and where they sit in the recruiting rankings and why the 2026 recruiting class could be the best of the Fran Brown era so far. And big reason is because, well, what we're going to talk about here on this first segment, the Orange recently picked up a verbal commitment from four-star wide receiver Amare Gough. All that and more here on this edition of Locked On Syracuse. Now, before we get to everything, today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. So first of all, I apologize for the one-day delay of this podcast. I wanted to do it yesterday, but unfortunately, I was a little bit under the weather. I am feeling a bit better now. I'm not 100%. You might be able to tell from my voice and my overall congestion, but I am at least good enough to be able to sit down and actually record a podcast for you all. So again, I apologize. This was meant to go out on Sunday, but instead it's coming out on Monday. Let's get to the content portion of this podcast. And over the weekend, Syracuse football landed one of the better wide receivers in the 2026 recruiting class. They got a verbal commitment from four-star Amare Gough. He is from Richmond, Virginia. He was offered by Syracuse following its bowl victory over Washington State in late December. He chose Syracuse over schools like Boston College, NC State, Virginia Tech. I believe Maryland was also involved in Amare Gough as well. So that alone is a pretty solid recruiting victory right there. And we'll get to the ratings in just a moment here as far as where Amare Gough ranks on ESPN, On3, 24/7 Sports, all the major recruiting services. But on 24/7 Sports alone, Amare Gough is a top 10 player in the state of Virginia. And it's very important that Syracuse football recruits the DMV area because while it's not a home base, so to speak, home base for Syracuse football recruiting is the Northeast. We're talking about New York, New Jersey, some Pennsylvania as well. That's where Syracuse football really has to win in recruiting. But if you want to argue that the second most important spot for Syracuse to dominate is the DMV area, well, I'm not going to necessarily challenge you on that. Also, keep in mind that Fran Brown is doing wonders across the state of Florida as well. But keep in mind that DMV area is very important for Syracuse football recruiting. We know how important it is for Syracuse basketball, especially with the amount of commitments they've gotten from that area in recent years. Donnie Freeman and Judah Mintz, just to name a couple of them. Let's go over the ratings for Amare Gough, and we'll also go over a scouting report of him. So he's a four-star recruit on On3 and on 24/7 Sports. He is rated as high as the 34th best wide receiver in the country and 212th overall player in the country on 24/7 Sports. He is a 3-star on ESPN and on Rivals. Let's get to the scouting report. So this is just an estimation here. Amare Gough on 24/7 Sports, he's listed at 6'1", 175 pounds. He is a track and field athlete, according to 24/7 Sports. He recently ran a 10.97 100-meter dash. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, what does that mean? You know, translated to the American system for measurements, right? Well, a 10.97 100-meter dash is about the equivalent of a 4.57 40-yard dash. So this is a track and field athlete. And keep in mind, he's running a 4.57 40 as a junior in high school. Next year will be his senior season. And really, it's going to be 2 years until Amare Gough is set to play actual games for Syracuse football. So he's got plenty of time to get even faster than that 4.57 40-yard dash. And I think it's likely that it will get faster, especially as he develops even further. According to a Rivals interview, Amare Gough says he believes he's a deep threat wide receiver, hence, his elite speed already at his age. And you look at his numbers last season, 39 catches for 893 yards and 12 touchdowns, but divide 893 by 39 because that's how many yards per catch that you'll find Amare Gough averaged last season. Well, I already did the math for you. That's about 23 yards a catch. So that is elite as it gets. This is a deep threat wide receiver for Syracuse football and overall a massive recruiting victory. Now, it should be noted that also today, Syracuse football did have a slight recruiting miss. But I don't think it's necessarily that big of a deal now that Amare Gough, a 4-star wide receiver from Virginia, is in the recruiting class for 2026. It appears that Syracuse will not get another 4-star wide receiver, this one from New York, Messiah Hampton. On 3, Steve Wiltfong, who does not normally get things wrong. He logged a prediction today for Oregon to land the number 1 overall player in the state of New York. And while it's a bummer that Syracuse this year could not get the number 1 player in the state of New York, you would think that Syracuse would be among the favorites, and they were certainly among the teams that were in on Messiah Hampton. I'm not necessarily as disappointed about it because you get a 4-star and a guy like Amare Gough, and second of all, they are also firmly in the mix for one of the best wide receivers in the country, a top 5 overall wide receiver in the country, elite 4-star recruit, Alvin Russell from Miami, Florida. So we'll have to keep an eye on that recruitment. I don't think he's going to commit until right before signing day. So long ways to go with him, but Syracuse is firmly in the mix for a guy like Calvin Russell as well. What do you think of this recruiting win for Syracuse football? Big deal? Not big deal? Is it just another day for Fran Brown and company? Comment your thoughts in the comment section below. Now, coming up, the big question. Will Syracuse football keep its highly ranked recruiting class? That's coming up next on Locked On Syracuse. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go between dining out, online shopping, entertainment? It's easy to lose track, and that's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place, so you stop just managing your money and you start building wealth. Instead of juggling multiple apps, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track spending, and even plan long-term goals. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONCollege for half off your first year. This is Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and once again over the weekend, Syracuse football picked up a verbal commitment from 4-star wide receiver out of Virginia, Amare Gough. And with that commitment, combined with everything else that Syracuse football has done so far in its 2026 recruiting class, I think it's safe to say that Syracuse is off to an outstanding start to this upcoming recruiting cycle. First of all, the Orange have 16 total verbal commitments so far in the class of 2026. That is second in the country. And in 2025, for context, Syracuse football led the country with 35 commits, according to 24/7 Sports. So once again, it seems like Syracuse is going to have one of the highest quantity of recruiting classes in the country. Now, regarding the quality of the 2026 recruiting class, well, it's shaping up to be really, really strong for the Orange. On 24/7 Sports, they have the ninth best recruiting class in the country. They are also ninth in the composite rankings. The composite rankings are important because they factor in the other recruiting services like ESPN, On3, and Rivals. So the fact that they're ninth on 24/7 Sports and ninth in the composite rankings is a big deal for Syracuse football. And on 24/7 Sports, they have the second best class in the ACC. I would say that's pretty good. What do you think? Comment in the comment section below, right? On3, Syracuse has the 25th rated recruiting class in the country, so still lower than 24/7 Sports, but top 25 in the country. I mean, that's pretty damn good for Syracuse football, and it is sixth best in the ACC. Now, will these rankings hold up? Will Syracuse end up with a top 10 recruiting class over on 24/7 Sports or a top 25 class over on On3? As far as top 10 is concerned, chances are that will not necessarily hold up. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm a Syracuse fan. I'm a Syracuse alum. I want the team to win and get all the best players. However, I don't think it's necessarily realistic right now for Syracuse to have a top 10 recruiting class in the country when everything is all said and done, right? I don't think that's necessarily realistic. However, what I will say is I have a lot of optimism that this will be the best or at least the highest rated recruiting class in the Fran Brown era. For context, Syracuse's 2024 recruiting class was slightly better than Syracuse's 2025 recruiting class, at least according to the rankings, which, again, you can kind of take with a grain of salt, but we're going to use the recruiting rankings in this case to determine which class was better. Obviously, we'll see how it all plays out on the field as far as who becomes good and who doesn't in the recruiting class. But in 2024, it was higher than 2025. It was 37th on 24/7 Sports and on On3 in the country. The reason the 2026 recruiting class will likely exceed 2024 is because of the quality of players that are already in the 2026 class. I posted this on Twitter at LO_Syracuse that Syracuse right now has 4 players in the class that are rated 4 stars on at least 2 major recruiting services. Think about that talent for a second. The Orange football, mind you, they have 4 players in the class so far that are rated 4 stars on multiple recruiting services. Amare Gough is a 4-star on 24/7 Sports and on On3. Jarius Rogers, a 4-star on 24/7 Sports and on ESPN. Javion Cooper is a 4-star on On3, ESPN, and Rivals. So he, out of all the recruits, is the closest to being a consensus 4-star recruit. You got Cameron Wilson, a 4-star on ESPN and on Rivals. And not only are these players 4-star recruits, they are all rated as a top 300 player in the country on at least one major recruiting service. You're getting, or at least Syracuse in this case, is getting some of the best players at their respective positions in the entire nation. Amare Gough is rated as high as the 34th best wide receiver in the country on 24/7 Sports. Jarius Rogers is rated as the 23rd best edge rusher in the country on 24/7 Sports. Javion Cooper is the 18th best tackle in the country on ESPN. And Cameron Wilson, to round it up, is the 30th best edge rusher in the country on Rivals. All of this is to say that Syracuse football recruiting remains really strong, at least relatively speaking, pre-Fran Brown era and now in the Fran Brown era. It's very healthy. They are getting top talent to commit to them. And before you sit here and say, well, these are just verbal commits, most of the time, when you get a verbal commitment, they stay. Now, it's not a guarantee because a verbal commitment, it can doesn't hold up necessarily. I mean, it's like a handshake agreement. There's nothing signed that says that you are going to go there. However, I once ran a study on this, so you can probably find it at LO_Syracuse if you search it up. I believe Syracuse in the last 5 years, it's about 90% according to 24/7 Sports as far as the actual players that they get versus the amount of decommits that they get. So when you get a verbal commit, that is a very big deal. And at the end of the day, you'd rather have the verbal commit than not have the verbal commit. And overall, I think that Syracuse football is in a very healthy state so far as recruiting. And if the Orange have a good to really good season next year with that schedule, combined with their recruiting rankings over the last few years in the Fran Brown era, I got news for all of you. Syracuse football is going to have to pay up to Fran Brown. They're going to have to pay up. You look at the schedule coming up for Syracuse. You got Tennessee neutral site, at Notre Dame, at Clemson, at SMU, at Miami, at Georgia Tech. It's one of the toughest schedules in the country next year. They have a good year. They're going to have to really pay up to keep head coach Fran Brown because the recruiting that he has done with Syracuse compared to the last 10 to 15 years, I honestly never thought I would see it, where Syracuse has 4 players rated in the top 300 overall. So that just about does it. Talking about Syracuse football recruiting. Now coming up, we'll talk about what Syracuse basketball should do now that instead of 20 conference games next year, they're going to only have 18. That's coming up next on Locked On Syracuse. Late last week, we found out officially that the ACC is going to change up its basketball schedule. Now, in case you missed it, they are going from 20 conference games for every team to now 18 conference games for every team. That means that every ACC team next season is going to play in 2 more non-conference games than they were supposed to. And of course, because Syracuse basketball is in the ACC, this applies to them. The reason the ACC is doing this is to essentially get more teams into the NCAA tournament, because if you beat up on bad non-conference teams by 30 points, it's actually really beneficial as far as the net rankings and KenPom and all the advanced metrics to determine which teams should get in the NCAA tournament and which teams should be left out. So that's why the ACC is ultimately doing this. Now, this is a Syracuse show, so we will talk about this from a Syracuse angle. What should Syracuse do with its 2 extra non-conference games next season? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments section below right now. Should Syracuse schedule 2 more quote-unquote cupcakes next season, or should they schedule a couple more tough Power 5 conference games? Here's my answer, okay? Because I asked you all, and I'd love for you to comment in the comments section below, and I'll get back to you. I don't really care what Syracuse decides to do. And I'll tell you why in just a moment here. But what Syracuse really needs to focus on next season is being better as a team, just from a team perspective, if that makes sense. Because last season, it didn't really matter who Syracuse basketball was playing. So let's go over the quote-unquote cupcakes, right? Sure, Syracuse could use its 2 extra non-con games to schedule a couple of opponents that they should be able to crush, right? They could do that. And that'll certainly be beneficial to Syracuse and any team in the ACC that decides to do it, because, again, beating them by 30-plus points is really going to help your NCAA tournament chances. But against non-Power 5 schools last season, here were Syracuse basketball's results. They beat Lemoyne by 4, Colgate by 2, Youngstown State by 9, but that was in double overtime. Cornell by 10, UAlbany by 17, Bucknell by 12. The average margin of victory for Syracuse basketball in their non-con, non-Power 5 games last season was 9 points. So Syracuse next year, if they want, they could schedule more of those type of games where you're playing more Youngstown States and you're playing more Lemoynes and Bucknells. You could do that if you're Syracuse. But it really only helps you if you dominate against those cupcakes. Because if you don't, they actually hurt the team significantly. If you recall, when the net rankings first came out, and the net doesn't come out until a couple of weeks into the college basketball season, but Syracuse was down in the 170s in the first net rankings a year ago, in large part because they barely were able to beat those teams like Lemoyne and Youngstown State at the beginning of the season. They already put themselves in a hole that was pretty much impossible to overcome as far as making the NCAA tournament. So Syracuse basketball next year, if they want to do that, the only way it's going to help them is if they beat them by 20 to 30 points. Now, you could sit here and say, well, let's do Power 5 opponents, teams that should actually be good next season. I think many of you, including myself, we would love to see Syracuse go up against some old Big East rivals. You'd love to see them go against UConn and St. John's, and the schedule allows them to do that. If they wanted a schedule against those teams, I'm sure those teams won't necessarily say no, and we could have a Syracuse St. John's game or a Syracuse UConn game. They could probably work out a deal with those top level teams, but the issue with that is Syracuse is already going to be playing against tough Power 5 opponents next season in their non-con schedule. Remember that Syracuse basketball is going to play in the 2025 Vegas Players Era Tournament, which gives every team a certain amount of NIL money. I believe it's $1 million just for participating, which is huge. Some of the teams that are in that tournament include and are not limited to Alabama, Auburn, Houston, Michigan, Gonzaga, and many other elite level programs. I think St. John's is going to be there as well. So regardless of what they decide to do as a program with their non-conference schedule next season, they just have to focus on being better as a team. Because last year, it wouldn't have mattered who they were going to play. They played against some tough teams. They played against Maryland. They got dominated. They played against Tennessee. Now, that's the ACC, SEC challenge, but they got dominated. They also played against Texas and Texas Tech, and those were actually two of the better games that Syracuse basketball played a year ago. But no matter what they decide to do, they just have to be better as a team. But I'd love to hear from you in the comments section below what you would like to see Syracuse basketball do now that it has 2 extra non-conference games next season. Now, as far as what is coming up on Locked On Syracuse in the future, tomorrow the plan is once again to go over some Syracuse basketball. We'll talk about the role of every single Syracuse basketball transfer that they have gotten so far. And then on Wednesday, importance level for every Syracuse basketball transfer so far. All right, so that's what's coming up on Locked On Syracuse in the future. Thank you for making Locked On Syracuse your first listen today. And for your second listen, you can check out the Locked On Portal Show with football recruiting expert Brian Smith, who's got the latest rumors and signings and high school recruiting each and every day. You can be the most informed fan on the rapid changes to the college football landscape, and you can find the Portal Show on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Folks, thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for listening. If you like this podcast, be sure to hit that like button. If you really enjoy the podcast, be sure to hit subscribe and turn on those notifications so you know right away when I am dropping the next podcast. And also, if you could be so kind, just tell 1 or 2 of your closest Syracuse friends about the Locked On Syracuse podcast so this channel can grow and reach all Syracuse Orange fans. And with that, I will see you all again soon.